Okay, let's begin our review. We're going to start with period one, of course. This is the post-classical era. If you if you ever get a topic on an essay and that they'll give you the time frame, you can put the years, you can put the time frame, but a lot of you guys in the past, you keep wanting to put like in period one or in period two. It is a lot better if you would rather say during the post-classical era, or of course, if they give you a specific time frame, then you just need to write it out. But um, try to avoid saying things like period one or period two, because if it was just some random person reading it, they wouldn't know what that time frame is. Of course, now you're going to have actual professional people who know what they're talking about reading and proofing your scoring your essays, but just so that it comes out better and it's a lot more smooth and a lot more sophisticated. Try to stick with the actual type or name for that era. Okay, so this is post-classical. Okay, so in the way of context, and I just threw these slides together, uh, so they're a little different than what I've done in the past, but I want to make sure I'm as thorough as I can be for you guys because I can't be there. So period one, we're pretty much looking at going back to Unit 0. So remember the year we started Unit 0, it was just pretty much a review of everything that occurred during the classical era. So we had already seen the rise and fall of many empires, particularly the Roman world, of course, um, but there were additional ones as well throughout the rest of the world. So we're kind of picking up the pieces from that. There were new religions that had taken hold, new trade relationships that were beginning to emerge. And without the agricultural revolution, the Neolithic revolution, and of course, the spread of agriculture, these periods and states would not have developed at the time and locations that they did. For the AP College Board curriculum, just so you can see what the weighting is for the exam. Those of you who took the practice one over the weekend, you probably already noticed this, but Unit 1, the Global Tapestry, that's pretty much just the state building. Remember, every single section was a different region of the world. Um, and then Unit 2 is networks of exchange. And we've got the three major networks that we'll discuss when we get to that. This is 1200 to 1450, of course, and both of the units account for anywhere from 8 to 10% of the questions you are going to see on the test. So most of the time you're going to see these in the format of multiple choice questions, and you should have several multiple choice question sets that I was able to post through AP Classroom. So if you've not done so yet, check those out. That's a great practice for you all. Um, but you have not as much of a weighted percentage for period one on the exam because there would be no pre-context for you guys to kind of build off of from the previous period if you had never taken an ancient civ class before. Okay, this is an image that came from Freemanpedia, Ben Freeman. You guys might be watching his reviews right now, but he does great with visuals. His thematic maps and everything else are pretty amazing. But this is his post-classical era time grid, and as you can see, it goes back to 600 CE. This used to be one of before they made the change to modern history and it was AP World History, the unit was 600 CE to 1450 CE. So it was a pretty big chunk of time. And then in 2020, they decided that future curriculum would just begin at 1200. So it kind of split this one, this previous unit right in half. And they used to call them units, not periods. But you can see he's got everything divided up by region. So you've got the Middle East, East Asia, Europe, Africa, and so on. He has icons that demonstrate and kind of show like when these religions would have emerged if they hadn't been developed yet. He's got some Viking stuff down here, but you can pretty much see every single bar is a different dynasty or state, kingdom, empire, something like that that existed at that time. So you can see the overlap that occurred, significant historical figures. And then, of course, we've got Black Death that is going to cause a major disruption throughout Afro-Eurasia during this time period. Unit 1 is titled The Global Tapestry. Remember, shaking out the cobwebs. This was Basically all of Unit 1 is kind of going region from region around the globe saying, what states existed, were there any significant cities, what were the governance and politics like, state system, culture, societal hierarchy, everything like that. So that is how Unit 1 is broken down. This is another picture, of course, from Ben Freeman. And this just kind of shows you just an overview look at a map where all the major states and empires would have existed. But we're going to look at each region specifically moving on. And this is a map that shows the location and extent of the major religions that are brought up at this time. Uh, Islam is going to be here in the green. Buddhism is going to be over here in East Asia and Southeast Asia, a little bit of Central Asia. And then we've got Hinduism in the subcontinent of South Asia. And then, of course, Christianity throughout Europe and down into what will become Ethiopia. We had some other ones that existed at this time that have been here for a while, and then we're going to see some syncretism as well. But Confucianism, of course, did exist, and we also had Taoism and then Shintoism throughout Japan. So those are going to be the major religions. Now, one of the big things because of interconnectedness during this time period is the spread of these religions even more, and then of course the blending of different aspects and characteristics of these religions with each other to come up with a new type of religion. And there are a couple that you do need specifically to know from period one. Okay. I also was able to go into AP College Board and screenshot the different thematic focuses for each one of the sections. So for specifically 1.1 developments in East Asia, the major countries you're going to be looking at here are going to be China, Japan, Korea. Those are the pretty much the major kingdoms, dynasties, states that you will get a question from for East Asia, particularly at this time. Um, so for the AP College Board, you can kind of, I've said this before in class, but you can kind of predict what kinds of questions they are going to ask based off of these different focal topics. So for 1.1, you've got the thematic focus of governance. You can read through all this on your own time if you want to, but the historical developments and learning objectives is going to kind of give you an example of how these questions could be framed. So if you look right here, it says explain the systems of governance employed by Chinese dynasties and how they developed over time. That's continuity and change over time. You can see that right there. So if they were to ask a question about governance around this time, you can automatically assume that if it has to do with East Asia, chances are they're going to probably try and frame that question about from the historical uh, thinking skill of continuity and change over time. If we look at historical developments, it says empires and states in Afro-Eurasia and the Americas demonstrated continuity. There it is again. Innovation and diversity during this time. It included the Song Dynasty. So anytime you see a specific proper noun like this being mentioned, that is pretty much a dead giveaway that you have a very high likelihood of seeing this specific term on the AP exam. That's why these sections of specific parts and content and curriculum are put in the curriculum guide the AP publishes. So you can, again, look at these and you can really kind of determine if they're going to ask a question, how are they going to phrase it? What will the historical thinking skill be? What will the theme be? Well, you've got the three major themes right here that they're going to focus on for 1.1. And then if you look at the actual details, you'll see vocabulary pop up, which is specific to, again, the higher likelihood that you will see those types of questions and topics and vocabulary on the test. So we've got Song Dynasty, Confucianism, imperial rule. So anything along those lines over here for the theme of culture. We see explain the effects of Chinese cultural traditions on East Asia over time. We see the term effect right here, so we know that the historical thinking skill focus is going to be causation to some degree. For historical developments, Chinese cultural traditions continued continuity and they influenced neighboring regions. Influenced is another effect, right? So you've got to keep that in mind as well. And now we've got specifics here. So Buddhism and its core beliefs continue to shape societies. So we've got a societal aspect there in Asia and included a variety of branches, schools, and practices. So that would be the key information that you have a high chance of seeing on the test or on the exam based off of 1.1 with the theme of culture. For economics, explain the effects. There we go again. So causation of innovation on the Chinese economy over time. With this one, as you can see, there is an overlap because even though the thematic focus here is going to be on economic systems, innovation is its own category. You've got technology and innovation. So there is a slight overlap there. Basically, what you need to understand with this is that the innovation that they are specifically talking about right here was an innovation that impacted economic systems. So you might already be thinking about certain things, especially when we talk about Song China, which again is mentioned right here. So the economy of Song China became increasingly commercialized while continuing to depend on free peasant and artisan labor. And then the economy of Song China flourished as the result, causation, of increased productive capacity, expanding trade networks and innovation in agriculture and manufacturing. One big thing that we discussed involving Song China is going to be the flying cash, that paper money. And so that's going to be both an innovation, but it's also part of the theme of economics. Anything involving trade or anything involving money, whether the money is being exchanged, maybe it's the revenue, what type of currency, is it a metal, is it paper? Anything involving that would be economic systems. All right, so this is a focused in look, again, using Freemanpedia, of the different dynasties that could pop up. Well, they will pop up on the test or on the exam at the end of the year. Now, remember, there are only four major dynasties, well, five major dynasties you would need to know um, for for the entire exam. And so we start off with the Song Dynasty, right? So that's going to be this time period. And then we have the invasions from the northern nomadic groups. The Yuan Dynasty is going to take over with leadership with Kublai Khan, of course. And then following that, we are going to see the resurgence of the Ming Dynasty. And then in period two and beyond that, so in period two, beyond the end of 1450 with period one, we will see the Ming Dynasty emerge. So well, we'll see it ends in 1644, but we'll see it begin in 1368. So there's a little bit of periodization there. But the three of the major dynasties you need to know for all of the AP content actually exist in period one by itself. So, and we've discussed that before in class. You've also got Korea. You have Japan right here. All right. So, and then right here he puts a little nugget of information. So this map covers over 250 years of history. So that's why you see the overlapping right here of the different dynasties in China. And I love it. He's hilarious. He puts little heads representing Marco Polo um, into East Asia at this time as well. Okay, so leading up to 1200, in China in particular, it was very decentralized. They had experienced decades of strong central control that resulted in a very prosperous China. The Qin dynasty introduced a strong centralized bureaucracy that remained and expanded under Song control, which demonstrated an example of continuity in East Asia. The Tang dynasty improved agriculture, roads, canals. All of this will encourage foreign trade. There was not a big gap between the end of the Tang Dynasty and the beginning of the Song Dynasty, and because they are characteristically so similar, you a lot of times they are a lot of people just kind of blend them together. They had some distinct differences, but for the most part, they had a lot more similarities. Um, in the way of bureaucracy, they did have a centralized imperial bureaucracy, which required members of government to take merit exams. This is a huge key focus. If you get a question on the test about the legitimacy and ability for Song China to maintain a social order and political control bureaucracy over its people, the biggest thing is going to be the imperial bureaucracy, how it was centralized, but in particular utilizing the merit-based examination system. They expanded the imperial bureaucracy, which made it easier to lower class people to be able to take the exam and enter the government. This eventually, though, will hurt Song China because the large bureaucracy became too expensive to maintain. And this is always a characteristic that will bring about the collapse of significant dynasties and empires. We see this at almost every single time. Just a little side note, the Chinese meritocracy system provided more upward mobility than any other government hiring system in the world at the time. It was still somewhat limited though, because you did have to pay in order to take this exam. And so if you didn't have the money, you couldn't take it. In the way of innovation, this is another big theme, something that we see a lot on the test at the end of the year, and that is going to be new innovations that will emerge during Song China. The Grand Canal will, of course, increase trade. Steel and iron production allowed farming tools to become more strong and more efficient. Champa rice. I mean, this is last year. This is the very first question, multiple choice wise, was about champa rice. So there is a very high likelihood that you could see something on the test about this. Is just one of those terms that is very, very specific and distinct to this time period, in particular with East Asia. It was a high calorie rice that grew in dry soil throughout the year. It was a drought resistant grain or type of rice. And it long term effect is because we're going to see multiple growing cycles within one growing season, and the fact that it was drought resistant, there's going to be a much higher production rate for champa rice than other rices in the past. And because of that output, that increased output, more consumers will be able to eat this product. And because it was high starch, like all rices, there was a high caloric increase in people's daily diets. So because of that, we will see an increase in population growth. That's going to be the most significant thing that we will see because of that. Is eventually China is going to have their population is going to grow at a very, very rapid rate because of the increased calories in their diet from the champa rice. Uh, in addition, China was known at this time for certain luxury goods. They created unique porcelain and silk luxury items that were highly desirable among other trade regions. These innovations allowed fewer people to farm, so more people began to specialize. Job specialization began to emerge in Song China. People would focus on maybe some type of art, some type of media. They would, of course, we had our laborers, but we started to see again a little bit more job specialization during this time period. A lot of times people will use the word industrialization, but this is not industrialization yet. We are not going to see that term until much later. What you can describe this as is proto industrialization. So it's the beginning of it. It is a highly commercialized society at this time, but it is not industrialization like what we see later on with the Industrial Revolution itself. In the way of religion, Confucianism was the first major religion of the Song dynasty, which of course emphasized filial piety. This was the idea that men were the head of the household and their needs came before everyone else. When new religions entered China, the government was hesitant to give up Confucianism and this idea. Buddhism, we know, was introduced to China through the Silk Road, through merchants traveling. It did combine with Taoism to create Zen Buddhism, which is a syncretic religion. that does pop up frequently on the test. It was popular among Chinese people, but the people who were devout traditionalist Confucianists, they were very, very resistant against this. And if you remember, one of the FAQs you guys took at the beginning of the year was the question was, concerning how do we know that Confucianism or Buddhism began to become much more popular in China at this time. And we know this because a lot of members of the elite class started pouring money into the construction of these monasteries. And that alone kind of makes you realize that if the elite class is doing this, there's a need for these temples to be constructed. They've already converted themselves. So we do see to some degree an increase in the amount of people who will practice Buddhism. But in the end, Confucianism will prosper. But we do see a syncretic religion that did kind of blend these religions once they merged. Neo Confucianism rose in Song China as a response to the rise of Buddhism. So, because Buddhism became popular among certain groups in China, there were certain elements that were added to Confucianism to kind of create this almost like a hybrid between the two. Um, and again, this was a complete and total response to the presence of Buddhism. For some people who were kind of traditionalists, they didn't want to give up Confucianism, but they liked certain characteristics of Buddhism. They were able to just kind of blend those together. Each of these are going to impact local areas like Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. Another big key aspect for this time period involving East Asia is the tribute system. And that is going to be, again, a major thing that you could see asked on the exam. The only exception, if you remember, we are going to see a lot of influential aspects of Chinese culture being forced in some locations, especially Vietnam. Some of those characteristics being forced upon the people. Korea, depending on the time, we see a little bit of that as well. But Japan was an outlier. They were separated from the mainland, being an island nation. And because of that, anything that we see that is Chinese in essence at this time culturally that has now made its way to Japan, it was voluntary. They were never forced to begin a merit-based system or to practice Confucianism. It was 100% voluntary. Confucianism, Buddhism, and Neo-Confucianism spread around Asia. This is mainly through trade, and because of that, we will see the introduction of new ideas, art, and architecture. And so you have an image right here of the Buddha. In the way of social stratification, Song China was the most urbanized land in the world. There was some social mobility in China with the emperor at the top, the scholar gentry class. These were the educated Confucius philosophers. Below them, followed by farmers, artisans, and craftsmen, and then of course the merchants at the very bottom. They were seen as driven by money, and because of that, untrustworthy. Below them were peasants and the poor. But a lot of times you would see the merchant class kind of going back and forth between which was truly at the bottom. They were not respected at all, though we do know that much. In the way of women, so anything involving women's roles in society, that is a social construct. So if you get a social based thematic essay, one thing you can kind of always default to, other than social hierarchy, is what role did characteristics of society play on women, or what was women's role in society at that time. For women during this time period, because of the rise of Confucianism, there were reemergence of Confucianism. We see elite members of society, any gains that women had had in previous dynasties was going to really kind of take a step backwards. And the major thing is with foot binding. Tribute system, again, this is a huge, huge term that is tested quite often on the exam at the end of the year. States surrounding China had to pay a tribute to China in the form of some type of monetary good or money itself. And this will, of course, continue to increase China's prosperity as well. The three major neighboring groups or regions are going to be Japan, Korea, Vietnam. They were heavily influenced by China. Japan, as I mentioned before, they adopted Buddhism and Confucianism, but they were not centrally governed. Remember, Japan is going to be in a feudal type system, just like what we're going to see happen in Europe. Korea, because of its close proximity to China, uh, some of these items were spread to them naturally, and because of this centralized system of government, the utilization and use and practice of Confucianism and Buddhism was a direct influence from China. With Vietnam, they adapted the Chinese system of writing, but they tried to resist sinification due to their unique views on family and culture. So Vietnam was one of those where we see a lot of forced characteristics upon them. All business had to be conducted in Chinese, but when they got home, they would speak in their own language. And they tried as much as they could to prevent um, that complete and total consuming um, all the different consuming characteristics of Chinese culture by maintaining some of their own. 1.2, that is the developments in Darul Islam. Uh, you've got the thematic focuses right here. If you want to hit pause and look through these, you are more than welcome to. Um, but just real quick, we've got the Abbasid Caliphate, we have Turkic groups, um, Muslim states, Darul Islam itself, for cultural developments, Islam, Judaism, Christianity as a core of belief systems. So those are some of the major terms because they are specifically mentioned again in the CED. You can definitely um, see these as high frequency type topics. But go back, hit pause, and look at how the learning objectives can kind of help you determine how these questions will be framed, just like we did with 1.1. After the death of Muhammad, Islam is going to spread very rapidly through military actions, merchants, and missionaries. These are the three M's, from Spain to India and from Egypt to Turkey. Following the fall of the Abbasid Caliphate before 1200, there was not a single unified Islamic government, but we did have regional Islamic empires collectively known together as Dar al Islam, and that stands for everything Islam touches. Uh, During this time period, innovation wise, they did make a lot of advances in math, literature, and medicine. A couple major different locations that we will have that are going to be major centers of learning. Of course, we have the House of Wisdom, and then Cordoba as part of Al Andalus. Those are going to be major cultural centers. The Abbasid Caliphate established their own Muslim empires after attacking and fragmenting the once unified Abbasid Caliphate. So each one of these groups that you see right here are going to, in some way, kind of peck away at the power hold that was the Abbasid Caliphate at this time. So we have the Mamluk Empire. These were those Turkish slaves working in Egypt who attacked and seized control of the Egyptian government. So this was kind of the first group to secede from Dar al Islam. Then the Seljuk Turks. These were Muslim Turks who captured parts of the Middle East, including Baghdad. And then in Spain, the Muslim Empire in Spain that had represented tolerance and collaboration between numerous religions in Muslim occupied territories. We're going to start to see that become questioned towards the end of this period because of Christianity and Christian groups that wanted to rid the Iberian Peninsula of um, that Muslim influence. In the way of innovations, there are specific scholars and poets and polymaths, philosophers from this time period. Al-Tusi is one of the big one. He was a celebrated Islamic scholar who made advances in math that laid the groundwork for trigonometry. We also had, I never know how to say her name. Um, I'm just gonna say I don't even want to try it. Al Bayunia. I don't know. I'm probably murdering that. But she was known as the most prolific female Muslim writer before the 20th century. She was a Sufi. She practiced Sufism. So, because of that, she had that mystical type of belief system. Uh, that was kind of a new version of the blending, kind of this mystical version of Islam. In the way of medical advances, doctors and pharmacists began studying for certified tests. This greatly increased standards of medical care in Dar al Islam. Culturally, Muslim scholars were known for taking learning from numerous cultures and building upon them. For example, they translated Greek classics into Arabic, they studied math from India, and they will eventually learn how to make paper from China. The next region is going to be developments in South and Southeast Asia. Again, you can look at these to try and determine what the questions are going to be. We've got Buddhism again, we have Hinduism over here. Again, religions. It's just going to be the major focus between these two. Are going to be the religious groups and then the governance. This is relatively new. Again, when they made the changes in 2020, a lot of the content that we see here in Southeast Asia was added to the curriculum. It was kind of just a side thought before. Again, before 1200, the golden age of India ended when the Gupta dynasty fell, resulting in 1,000 years of decentralization. South and Southeast Asia were characterized by interactions between Islam and Hinduism, the growth of trade, and this continuity of having this decentralized type of government. Well, it wasn't a type at all, it didn't exist. This is a map showing a close-up of the different states, kingdoms, empires that existed in South and Southeast Asia. So we had the most notable is maybe the Delhi Sultanate. That is, if there's any one major state for topic 1.3 that you need to know, Delhi Sultanate's going to be the one that is most frequently asked about on the exam at the end of the year. Okay, so as we said, they were largely decentralized, with regional empires growing over time. This region was heavily influenced by the trade relationship that they had with other regions. Islam greatly influenced the region, with many merchants converting to Islam to have a stronger trade relationship with Muslims. And these merchants were responsible for bringing Islam to Southeast Asia. And we know this because some of the highest percentages of population globally of people who practice Islam are actually going to exist in the this island region of Southeast Asia. Merchants, again, they were responsible for this. We had some in previous time periods. We during the classical era, we did see Ashoka send some missionaries out to try and spread uh, Buddhism, but for the most part, Islam is actually going to spread a lot further and have a lot more significant impact in this region once it is spread. Some Hindus did convert to Islam. The major reason why was to escape the caste system. Um, this was really the biggest draw. So if you were a lower caste individual and you had the opportunity to convert to Islam, that was your out. 1.4 developments in the Americas. Again, some of this was added as well um, for the thematic focus of governance. There was only one for 1.4, and that was explain how and why states in the Americas developed and changed over time. So continuity and change over time. If you're going to see a question about the Americas at this time, it will be most likely that historical thinking skill right there. So any topic, if you're going back and reviewing from the Americas, make sure that in your mind you're thinking about how did things stay the same and how did they change. Remember, if you get an essay question about from any time period that is asking for continuity and change over time, and you can only come up with changes, just keep in mind that if you do not state a continuity in your thesis statement, you will not get the thesis point. So please make sure you keep that in mind. So what changed? What stayed the same? It's got to be at least one for both. The big one here in the Americas is going to be the one that is most frequently discussed is going to be Mexica. I know some of you guys are like, why not just Mexico? It was referred to as Mexica at the time, later on by historians, just as a generalized location for these early empires and kingdoms that emerged in Central America during this time period. You could see Mesoamerica, but more often you will see, according to online sources, they have now kind of transitioned away from Mesoamerica, and now they're just referring to it as Mexica. All right. So we've got the Mesa Verde, Cahokia from the Sicilian culture. From Mexico, you've got Tenochtitlan. Remember, we talked about the Chinampas. There's different agricultural aspects that were pretty unique to some of these areas. For the Mayan, we've got Chichen Itza. For Inca, we've got the center of Cusco, the Incan roads, um, the Carpanon. So those are going to be some of the major key features. Something else to keep in mind, and we've not really talked about it much in the class this year, but the Polynesian migrations, and that's what these boats are over here for. I know it's ridiculous, but think Moana. Um, there are a lot of documented sources that do show that the Polynesian migrations made their way to the west coast of the Americas during this time period. Um, and so it kind of flips history on its head, of course, based off of who were the first non natives in this part of the world. But we do have plenty of evidence that suggests that the Polynesian migrations did make their way over to the west coast of the Americas. Uh, the first empire that grew in the Americas was the Toltec. They were highly militaristic and had a heavy focus on sacrifice. It's believed that the Toltec probably fell due to repeated attacks by the northern nomadic groups. For Mexica, again, that new buzzword, what this was primarily the Aztec. So they arose in the 13th century, so 1200s, near Lake Texcoco, which allowed for farming, fishing, and transportation. By 1434, the Aztec were dominant in the valley because they were able to successfully conquer other city states, creating their own tribute state. This would be a really cool comparison, but you're not going to see an essay topic specifically from period one because the percentage is not high enough. You could see a continuity and change from 1200 to 1750 or maybe to 1600, so that it pulls in it pulls in period one, but you would not see something distinct from that period for an essay. The capital city of Tenochtitlan was filled with farming, palaces, markets. The rulers were considered gods on earth, which did help to legitimize their rule during this time period. Incan Empire centered around Lake Titicaca in Peru. They were highly centralized with their main ruler over four provinces. Local leaders ruled, but they did defer to the Inca. They also created a tribute empire, Carpanon. That's that word that it's just the name for this connectedness of this large road network that they had, that connected all the different regions of this empire together. So it was at the time, it was one of the largest roads in the world, with checkpoints throughout. Advanced irrigation also made the Incan very, very skilled farmers. Uh, Similarities and differences between between the Aztec and Inca. So they were both built on earlier empires that did precede them. They were both excellent imperial and military organizers. They both had a highly organized agricultural sector under state control. They both consisted of ethnic groups which were allowed to survive based off of different types of tribute systems, of course. Both of these groups of people were animistic in their religion. And the craziest thing that we talked about in class was that they had no beast of burden. They had no draft animal for labor. So when you think about the Carpanon and the goods that these people had to transport through these mountains to different regions within the Incan civilization in particular, to know that they did not have an animal like a horse or something like that doing the carrying and lifting for them. We're going to see camels and horses being utilized during this time period throughout Afro-Eurasia, but in the Americas, they didn't have anything like that. Well, nothing that was domesticated, anyways. The Aztec had a very sophisticated trade network. and they had sophisticated markets, whereas the Inca did not have a specialized merchant class. In addition, the Aztec had a writing system, but the Inca did not. So those are some of the differences. The Mayan, before we had the Aztec, the Mayan were decentralized with city states that spread throughout the region. They were often at war with one another, and they were known for their art, architecture, their calendar, of course, and their astronomical system. Um, Other tribes were spread kind of sporadically throughout the Americas. They varied depending on their environment. Most of the empires are later on going to be weakened significantly by European contact. 1.5 is developments in Africa. For this one, again, we see the theme of governance. Explain how and why states in Africa developed and changed over time, obviously CCOT. And then for historical developments in Africa, as in Eurasia and the Americas, state systems demonstrated continuity, innovation, and diversity, and expanded in scope and reach. So again, that's you're going to see continuity and change over time based off of different characteristics of the way that they governed their people. Um, for African states that you would definitely see on the test or have a high likelihood of seeing, you've got the Kingdom of Mali, with Timbuktu as this cultural center, Sundiati, Mansa Musa, Ibn Battuta. These three men appear numerous times um, throughout different topics in period one. So because of that, well, especially Ibn Battuta, he's in like several different regions because he was a traveler. So high likelihood again that you're going to see questions about these three individuals. You also had the Hassa kingdoms, kind of in the center of this map. That was something new that had been added. We've talked a lot about Ethiopia as an outlier. That's going to be that Christian kingdom. Islam did spread, but Christianity will prosper. Great Zimbabwe in southern Africa is going to be that kingdom that existed that had the wall. Eventually, the people abandoned the location. Historians have tried to question or try to figure out the exact reason why. And it was probably just a combination of different things, actually. And then finally, the Swahili city states along the east coast that developed because of the Indian Ocean Trade Network, which is part of Unit 2. We did have some Portuguese voyages, which were sponsored by Prince Henry the Navigator. That's going to be towards the end of period one, and then we'll transition to much more travel by Europeans moving into period two. Before Islam was introduced to Africa, the societies were extremely diverse. Most people were either animistic or polytheistic. Most people spoke Bantu. The Bantu people spread not only their language, though, but their knowledge of metallurgy and agriculture throughout Africa. They had a stateless society. Many African societies were stateless, which meant that they did not have a centralized government of any type. Their society was also largely weak because they didn't have any type of tax system or large building program. When Islam was introduced to Africa, it was first introduced through missionaries. People did begin to convert because Islam was egalitarian. It did have a focus on the authority of the king. It kind of stratified that social hierarchy for them. So we did see a pretty large amount of people who converted to Islam, which will give early African societies equal footing within these Arabic societies. Way of the trade network, trade was improved by the use of the camel and camel saddles and caravans. Trade allowed these empires to prosper along this network through importing their own goods and trading with other kingdoms. Because of that, we see three really, really powerful empires emerge, and those were going to be Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. They became Islamic to grow political power and to have more control over the trade system. They traded with other Muslim nations and kingdoms throughout Africa, and they also set up tributary systems. Not at the same degree that we see in East Asia, and in the Americas, but they did have a type of tributary system established. In Central Africa, Islam did not spread to the region. It was difficult for people to travel there, and it was very because of the physical geography. There were lots of valleys and escarpments, and very cut off groups of people. And so, because of that, because of the natural geography, we did not see a major expansion towards the interior of Africa. Um, from merchants at this time and people who were trying to spread Islam. Great Zimbabwe was the primary kingdom of note in southern Africa. It was a large non Islamic society dominated by the gold trade on coastal ports in the Indian Ocean network. And of course, we will see the construction of that Great Wall for protection. Something that pops up frequently on these tests is if you get a picture of this wall in Great Zimbabwe, a lot of times they will ask about the construction of it. The key thing that sometimes will come up is the fact that they did not use mortar or pestle to construct the wall. They did not have any type of glue essentially that made the bricks stick together. What they did was at the base of the wall, the bricks were a certain size, and every single step up from that brick underneath, there was just a fraction of a size difference between the one below and the one on top. So as you continue to go higher and higher, the brick at the very top of the wall was going to be significantly thinner and not as wide as the one that was at the base of the wall. And the fact that we still have a portion of the wall standing today really kind of demonstrates the precise mathematical change that they had to have figured out to construct a wall like this without any type of glue to hold it together. Ethiopia was previously known as the Kingdom of Aksum. It was a link between the Arab and Mediterranean world. It was exposed to pretty much every single Abrahamic religion at this time, so Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They did experience a lot of trade because of their proximity and their kind of link between Eurasia. Because of this, we see a lot of global connections with the spread of Islam. It did open Africa up to global trade, but most of Africa developed independently. And again, Ethiopia is going to be from period to period that kind of outlier that does not fit with the rest of the history of Africa. The last one is developments in Europe 1.6. There were three different thematic focuses here: social interactions and organization, cultural developments and interactions, and then governance. Again, you can look back through to see what the topics are here. Some of the big ones that stand out, though, is manorial system, feudalism, coerced labor, serfdom, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, of course. And so those are going to be some of the key topics that you will see. This is the map that shows the major kingdoms here. So this was the one where we talked about the Frankish kingdoms and the development of the Holy Roman Empire and Charlemagne. We've got France, the Republic of Venice, Kievan Rus, which is going to be this blue area, the Golden Horde, the Byzantine Empire, and then everything else is going to kind of transfer throughout. Before 1200, after the fall of the Roman Empire, Western Europe was pretty much decentralized, and because a lot of the world was snuffed out, now we have entered into the Dark Ages or Middle Ages or medieval period. You could see it in any of those three ways, but basically it was just a way to say that Europe was backwards. Around 1100, Europe slowly began to come out of the Middle Ages. Uh, in the way of religion, we just see one kind of center here, and that's going to be Christianity as the primary religion throughout Western Europe. There were many places that traded with Asia, Africa, and the Arab world, and because of the prominence of Christianity, there had been a deep fear of other religions, and that persisted much later on. The time of decentralization, religion was the kind of glue that held Europe together. The Catholic Church, in particular, was highly organized, and it did become the most powerful institution in Europe. However, it does become increasingly corrupt in many places. The Christian Crusaders tried to end Muslim rule in the Holy Land. It was successful in some locations, but most importantly, it opened Europe up to more trade access with the Eastern world, especially when it came to the Far East and China. So that's going to be a major impact that we see there. Um, the Crusades predominantly were fought in the Middle East, as we know, but it is important that you do note that sometimes the AP College Board will ask questions about Al-Andalus, which is the Iberian Peninsula, present day Portugal and Spain, in particular the city of Cordoba. Once we start to see the Reconquista from the Spanish Christians, that is going to be a kind of side crusade in and of itself. So don't let that throw you if you see something like that on the test. Manorialism was the primary economic system that we saw throughout Europe at this time. It existed during a time of decentralization. Landowners would have peasants or serfs work and live on their land. In exchange for that, they would provide protection to the serfs. The manors were isolated, which meant they had a low level of production and not a lot of advanced technology. Because there was not a common centralized government that kept all of these different kingdoms together or these different towns together. Um, we saw that they were very, very vulnerable to specific raids, in particular from the Vikings. It was not the best system, but it did create a system of local rule with regional aristocrats. And of course, you have the lord and lady of the manor, that they were going to be at the very top of that. Feudal system is going to kind of replace manorialism. Manorialism was very much, it was is kind of more like an economic type. European feudalism is going to be social stratification. Um, it was a military and political system that provided more protection from Viking raids and from other raiding groups. The rule provided protection, or rules provide protection to aid the lesser lords, which were the vassals and nobles. Nobles then employed knights for protection, and peasants worked the land just as they had before in the manorial system. They were essentially slaves to the king. Their relationship was, now they were tied to the land. Slaves are owned property. Um, and these people were bound to the lands. So they were not technically owned by the lord or lady of the manor, but you kind of look at it as like the land owned them. They could not leave, they couldn't move. They had to continue to stay and work that land, regardless of whether or not, if the lord passed away fighting in the Crusades, and then there was a whole new family that came in and took power of that land, you still had to stay on that land. The feudal monarchs slowly grew. Manors were absorbed into larger kingdoms. A lot of these lords are going to go off to fight in the Crusades, and they are going to, some of them are going to pass away fighting. If their oldest son also passed away, they would not, because of the primogeniture laws, a lot of times the king would just absorb that land. And so we see a pretty high frequency of that during this time period. And because of that, over time, feudalism, uh, it just kind of fell, it collapsed. A lot of people were unhappy, in particular the peasants, of course. But we also see the Crusades kind of adding to the collapse of European feudalism. Over time, feudalism slowly transformed into a monarchical system with many movements in place to limit both the Catholic Church and the feudal system. The High Middle Ages, and that's kind of where the story begins in Europe here, was a time where feudalism decreased and industrialization is going to begin to increase, or proto-industrialization will begin to increase. This led to an increase in education and urbanization. Agricultural improvements and technological improvements will help Europe begin to catch up with the rest of the world. But then the plague is going to come in. And when the plague hits in the 1300s, we are going to see a significant impact in Western Europe. There are so many different estimates, but it is estimated that half of the European population did die. And the labor force was significantly slashed because of that, which made feudal lords want a tighter hold over their peasants. peasants began to revolt against the working conditions. Checks were put in place against feudal lords, and many people are going to begin to form guilds to control working conditions among craftsmen of the same skill, especially when it came to smithing. So between the primogeniture laws, the plague, and then the Crusades, there are going to be a couple different things that are going to really impact this feudalistic type of society.